Tom Mulcair, CTV News political commentator and former NDP leader. Hi, Tom. Good to see you as always.
Good to be with you, Renee.
Now, Tom, the Liberal caucus retreat begins in Halifax today. What can we expect to be on the agenda?
Well, this year's cabinet retreat resembles last year's cabinet retreat. It's actually Groundhog Day because last year, Renee, the top item on the agenda was the housing crisis that had been caused during the Liberal reign. And this year's top item is the housing crisis that took place while the Liberals were in power. And it took place because Canada has had a policy of vastly increasing immigration. We all understand and appreciate the country was built by immigrants, waves and waves coming in, but you have to have a little bit of planning if you're going to bring in the equivalent of the population of Manitoba every year. And there was no planning. This was an idea pushed by Dominic Barton, pushed by very smart people on Mr. Trudeau who bought into it completely. But of course, if you're going to do that, you have to plan for health services, social services, and yes, housing. So they're always going to be late trying to catch up on this thing, saying they're going to be building millions and millions of housing units. But frankly, it sounds very empty at this stage of the game, and I don't think Canadians are buying into it.
Are you expecting any progress to come out of this?
Well, on housing, they do have one good idea, saying that there is lots of federal land available. And they're talking about leasing it to developers, which is an interesting idea, and saying that the developers will have a chance to use that. They won't have to have that big capital outlay at the beginning of a project, and they can use that to build social housing. Now, if there are enough developers who are willing to do that, fine. But again, Renee, between now and the next election, not much is going to come of any of this except for putting a decently good idea on the table. But it's not going to solve the problem, anything but. You know, as we're heading into that cabinet retreat, you had that big picture that we were just seeing on our screens before you and I had a chance to speak, and you see how Mr. Trudeau has managed the country. That cabinet is just massive. And I would dare to say that most Canadians can't name more than a few people in that picture, because instead of having a very strong cabinet with a core group of people who can push big ideas forward, Mr. Trudeau's answer with the civil service is a massive increase in the number of bureaucrats. His answer with regard to his cabinet is a massive cabinet, but it's not working. And there's an old saying that when what you're doing doesn't work, try something else. And he just seems to be trying the same thing over and over again. There is one thing I'm going to keep an eye on with regard to this cabinet retreat. Pablo Rodriguez, who's got a very important dossier. It's transport. We're in the middle of this huge problem with our railroads in Canada. He has already signaled that he's thinking of running for the Quebec Liberal leadership. Well, he'd better figure that out and give a clear signal to Mr. Trudeau. And it's been several weeks now that he's been talking about it. And it's very uncomfortable for Mr. Trudeau because he's his Quebec lieutenant. So that's going to have to get figured out. And I don't think we're going to have a big cabinet shuffle, but I do think that we're going to have to Mr. Trudeau's going to have to try to figure out what to do about Mr. Rodriguez. And I would say he's probably going to have to replace him as transport minister. You can't be musing about going, leaving the sinking ship and going to another job and hope to stay there at the same time. So unless they've come up with a deal on their own, I think that Rodriguez is gone.
When looking at the polls before cabinet resumes in a few weeks, how is the Liberal Party doing? Because this is really going to be their final time for a reset.
Exactly. And that's what you and I were saying last summer when they went to Prince Edward Island. So yes, Parliament will be back in a few weeks. Yes, it will be the set piece arguments between Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Trudeau. Poilievre is ascendant. He dominates Trudeau completely in question period. Trudeau comes in with things that are written for him on a piece of paper, but it's not natural. Poilievre is a fighter. He's a debater. He loves the cut and thrust. Now, what Conservatives have to realize is they haven't won anything yet. It's one thing to be way ahead in the polls, but I think that, as a lot of observers have been remarking, one of the things you have to understand is that that's a reflection of the fact that people are just tired of Mr. Trudeau. He starts his 10th year in office in October. There is a finite limit to how much Canadians will put up with. We don't have the two-term rule like the Americans, 2 4-year term. But it's almost as if we did, Renee, because people do get very tired of seeing Mr. Trudeau. They're looking for change. Mark Carney is waiting in the wings. Everybody knows that. It's talked about openly. And he could probably change the Liberal fortunes overnight. The same way Kamala Harris coming in was able to change the Democrats' fortunes in the United States. But is Mr. Trudeau going to finally get that message? It's far from clear that that's the case.
Very interesting, and that's something we'll be keeping a very close eye on as well. All right, Tom Mulcair, CTV News political commentator and former NDP leader. Thank you as always. Nice chatting with you.
All the best, Renee.
You as well.